This first lecture is on the history of the Austrian school, and the purpose of a lecture like this, I think, me, it's threefold. First of all, whenever you get exposed to anything, you don't really appreciate what you're getting exposed to unless you know its history. If you go and visit a foreign country, if you really want to understand what you're experiencing, you better know a little bit about the history of that country. And that's true just about of any experience. So if you're going to be exposed this week to a good deal of ideas associated with the Austrian school, it would be, I think, helpful to get to know something about the background, the historical background of those ideas. Second, it's the case, in the case of Austrian economics, it is the case that one will not understand central ideas in the Austrian corpus of economic thought without understanding the development. So it's a fascinating example of intellectual history to go through the history of the Austrian school. That's the second. The third is my own personal excitement at thinking of 140 years of Austrian economics, beginning with 1871, all the way there. So it's 140 years till this year. And I get excited when I think that almost close to 60 years of that history has been, I've been an observer. When I joined the graduate school at New York University in 1954, it's close to 60 years now. So as I look back at that 60-year period, close to 60-year period, within the context of the 140 years, I find it of great personal significance, and I hope you forgive me for that, for bringing that personal point in. I've drawn this line to indicate the periods in which I think it's useful to divide the history of Austrian economics. I've put in colored chalk two periods of intense intellectual activity. The first 2 decades after 1871, I've called this the founding period, the period from 1871 till the First World War. That was generally recognized as the founding period. Then I put the years between 1914 and 1932. I put them as, you can call them the period of consolidation, and I'll have a lot to say about that period. Then this period C, the period between 1932 approximately and say 1974, is the period of which I would call the era of Hayek and Mises and Hayek. And this decade, the decade of the 40s, was in my opinion a decade of intense intellectual activity within this period. And it had a great deal to do with what has been called the revival of Austrian economics, beginning in the 70s. I will have much less to say about the period beyond 74 for a number of reasons. There's been a great deal of fascinating work, but I'm not really competent to say much about that work. But I do want to put that work in the context of the sweep of the overall sweep of the history of the Austrian school. The exciting part of this whole history is, I think, expressed that with hindsight we can see that the professional reputation of the Austrian school was totally mistaken and misunderstood. I put a big arrow here, and that's in 1954. That's when I myself was first exposed to Austrian economics. I came as a graduate student, and I joined Mises' seminar in 1954. And from that perspective, it's not an important period, it's not an important date in the history of Austrian economics, it's an important date for me. But from that perspective, okay, from that perspective, I can tell you that the Austrian economics at that time was considered to be dead. Not totally buried yet, but dead, okay? There were still some twitches of life that were recognized because Hayek was still alive, Mises was still alive, Hayek was still alive, and they were writing. But the general perspective, the general picture, you look in the history of thought textbooks of that period, there'll be a chapter on the Austrian school, and that chapter would pretty much finish by about the early 1930s, and there'll be some remarks, some footnotes about Mises and Hayek still publishing. The idea was at that time that Austrian economics was passé. Austrian economics was finished. It had lost. Doctrinally, it had lost to Keynesian economics. It had lost to socialist economic thought. It had lost to Knightian capital theory. It had lost in every major issue. Austrian economics had been defeated, and there was nothing left. There was nothing left. This was the picture in the, as I say, that I saw in 1954. It seemed from that perspective that Austrian economics was old-fashioned. It was working with 19th century tools. It had not kept up with the developments in mathematical economics. It was antithetical to the development of mathematical economics. It was out of date. It was finished. That was the picture in 1954. And I think the subsequent history of the school has demonstrated that picture of Austrian economics was utterly false. It was utterly mistaken, misunderstood. In fact, what was happening in this period was an intense decade of intellectual productivity that in many ways was more important than the 2 decades of intellectual activity that set the Austrian school into motion in the first place. This was the period, say, from 1871 till, say, 1890 or something like that, where you had the 3 great founders, Menger, Baumbarwerk, and Wieser. They were busy writing their books from about the 1880s. The other books were being written. Menger's book was 1871. The other books didn't appear until the 80s of the 19th century, but there was a period of very solid and intensive intellectual development. But what was happening in the 1940s, I think we can see with hindsight, we can see that what was happening here was as important and perhaps even more important than what took place over there, such that there was I would call it a revolution in Austrian thinking that has had tremendous long-run implications for the subsequent intellectual history of Austrian economics. So let's talk about the first part of this long period. My argument will generally be this, that I'll take 1932 as a point in time that will typify what was going on. The period from 1914 to 1932, Austrian economics was highly successful. It was one of the major schools of early 20th century thought in economics. You had the Marshallian school in Great Britain. You had the Walrasian, the beginnings of the development of Walrasian economics. And it was well recognized that the Austrian school was right there, up there in front of the modern developments, so-called modern developments of an economic thought. By modern developments, we were contrasting, one was contrasting the developments of the early 20th century with one Ricardian economics, classical economics, the economics of Ricardo and Mill, okay, and one was contrasting it with the German historical school. The Ricardian school was recognized as having been pushed aside in the so-called Marxist Revolution of about that same time. Menger was recognized as one of the three major components of that marginal utility revolution. But there were still a lot of rumblings of Ricardian economics still in this period. The German historical school was mainly successful in the latter decades, particularly the 80s and the 90s of the 19th century. And it took a while for Austrians to realize that they would no longer had to be fighting the German historical school. The German historical school was out of the picture. By 1932, there's a statement that I often quote. It was a statement that Mises endorsed. What he said was that today, all modern schools of economics are saying basically the same thing. So this was the idea, was that yes, the Marshallians in England, and we, the Austrians, and the Walrasians, were all saying the same thing. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? What could Mises have possibly meant by that? I can assure you that when I came into Mises in 1954, the fundamental message that was being pushed was that Austrians are different. Austrians are totally different from the neoclassical mainstream. So what did Mises mean in 1932? Well, what he meant was that all the schools have abandoned the German historical approach. That's basically what he meant. That's all. So you've got to realize that as the intellectual development of the Austrian school went on, the frontier was shifting. Okay, the frontiers of battle were shifting. In this period, the Austrians were fighting the German historical school, even more than they were fighting the Ricardians. They were fighting the German historical school. When Menger's book was reviewed in terrible fashion by the German historical school, and they were the dominant intellectual force in economics on the continent at that time. But so by 1932, it was realized that the German historical school was out of the picture. Instead of that, you've got the modern economics, modern meaning early 20th century economics, which recognize theory, which recognize that the demand side of the market has a lot to contribute to the chains of cause and effect. This was what was big recognized, and it was recognized that the Austrian component was one of the important components of modern Austrian economics. It was that period when, if you were, say, a young American professor making a trip to the continent of Europe, you would want to visit the major intellectual centers. One of the places you would want to visit would be the University of Vienna. You would want to sit in on the seminars there. You could get invited to give a paper that would be professionally great for you. Because what was going on in Vienna was one of the very important, it was one of the very important centers of intellectual ferment at the time. But it was not seen as fundamentally different from the rest of economics. There's the celebrated book by Lionel Robbins, Lord Lionel Robbins. If you're a British economist and you live long enough, you become a lord. Lionel Robbins, he spent a lot of time in the 20s, late 20s, he spent a lot of time in Vienna. and he absorbed a lot of the Austrian ideas. And he wrote his famous book, The Nature and Significance of Economics, in 1932. And this was published. It was almost all the footnotes are footnote references to Austrian economists. And what Robbins was saying was that, look, the Austrians have got their finger on some fascinating insights that can help us, the British economists, understand what we've been doing all the time. So it was not that the Austrians were developing ideas that were antithetical or inconsistent with the mainstream, Marshallian mainstream. On the other hand, Robbins was claiming that you could, this is quite explicit in Robbins, read his introduction to the book. He was claiming that we can, with the benefit of the Austrian insights, we can more fully appreciate what the central body of economics is. It's a body, a shared body of thought, just like Mises said. This was up until 1932. In the early 30s, this celebration of Austrian economics as something that can sort of a fresh set of ideas that can help enrich the common legacy of so-called modern economics. That picture began to unravel. That way of thinking of things began to unravel. It all began with the success of the Austrians. Hayek, a brilliant young Austrian economist, was brought to London by Robbins. Robbins brought Hayek to London, first as a visitor, and then a year later, in 1931, as a visitor. In 1932, he came as a full-fledged professor in London economics. A young fellow, he was 33 at the time, and he became an intellectual powerhouse. But he ran straight into the Cambridge School. He began to be writing papers that were contradicted by some of the major intellectual forces at Cambridge, Keynes himself, Schrafer, and it became to be perceived that Hayek was getting the worst of the debate. This was one of the major problems that began to beset the Austrian presence in London. I often cite my deeply respected and revered colleague Ludwig Lachmann, who came to London in 1934. And he said, when I came to London, everybody was a Hayekian, because when Hayek he brought in the Austrian capital theory. This was the excitement. Everybody was a Hayekian. 4 or 5 years later, Lachmann used to say, there were only 2 Hayekians left, Hayek and me. That was the picture. Now, what happened in those 4 or 5 years? Well, as I say, it seemed as if Hayek had been demolished by the Keynesians. It seemed as if Austrian capital theory had been demolished by Knightian capital theory. It seemed, most importantly, as if Austrian economics, Hayekian economics, was being demolished, disproved by the writers on the socialist calculation debate. This is one of the major issues that was taking up the profession in the 1930s. Okay, in the 1930s, the socialist calculation debate. As you may know, the 1920. Back here, Mises had written an essay in which he claimed that socialist economic planning was a contradiction in terms. There cannot be central planning without a market, for various reasons, which is not our present major concern. Okay, but he made that claim. He wrote a book in 1922, later translated as Socialism, in which the same point was made more in greater detail. That set off a great debate. That debate went on into the 1930s, and by the mid 1930s, the socialists had developed and articulated a very cogent set of arguments claiming to have responded adequately, more than adequately, to the Mises and Hayek challenge to the possibility of socialist economic planning. So that it seemed by the end of the 30s that the Austrians had been overwhelmed by Keynesian economics, by Canadian capital theory, by socialist economic theory. And what had happened, which seemed as if all of the major unique features of Austrian economics that set it apart at all had been pushed aside. And so that by the end of World War II, which was close to the time when I first came exposed to Austrian economics, by the end of the 1940s, it had seemed to the general public, as I mentioned earlier, that the Austrian school was pretty much dead. And yet it was precisely in that period, that there was a spirit of intellectual activity by Mises and by Hayek. Mises wrote his Human Action, which was a development of the book that had been written in 1940 in German. This was in Human Action was in 1948. Hayek wrote his book Individualism and Economic Order, also in those years, 1947, 48, 49. And those two books and the papers that were behind those books represented, in my opinion, a sustained intellectual effort that constituted a revolution in Austrian thought that picked it up and decisively directed Austrian economics in a direction different from that in which mainstream economics was taken. So that if one says that in 1932 Austrian economics and mainstream economics were saying the same thing, that's not completely wrong. It's not completely wrong. You have two lines of thought, pretty much the same, but they were going to take drastically different directions. And what we will see, I believe, is that the direction in which Austrian economics was going to take was based on fundamental differences that had been masked, that had been obscured in the period up to 1932. That's the general thesis that I'll be trying to develop here this morning. So let's get back to the beginning. We said earlier that Austrian economics was part of a marginal utility revolution. It was rebelling against Ricardian economics, classical economics. And I think if we understand what's going on here, we'll get a very helpful picture of the intellectual development of Austrian thought. Ricardian economics, as all economics, claims to understand the major chains of cause and effect in economic life. The major chains of cause and effect. There are systematic changes. There are systematic chains of cause and effect. Systematic causation. There is system in economic phenomena. See, at first glance, to a non-economist, economic affairs seem to be chaotic. Everybody does whatever they want to do. And there doesn't seem to be any clear-cut set of causative laws governing what happens. Economics, from the very beginning, has claimed that that's wrong. One can demonstrate, one can understand, one can identify systematic chains of cause and effect. And that was the great contribution of the classical school. They got it wrong, but the very concept, the very insight that there are systematic chains of cause and effect was a powerful insight, an insight that's going to be very fruitful over the subsequent history of economics. But the Ricardians, the classicals, their understanding was that what sets in motion the chains of cause and effect, what sets in motion these chains of cause and effect is physical reality. Physical reality. You've got human beings. Human beings find themselves in a world, a given world. That given world exercises powerful systematic effects on what happens in the economic sphere. So starting from relatively simple physical laws, such things as laws of diminishing returns, such fundamental understandings that you need fixed resources, you need labor, you need capital. Starting from fundamental physical understanding, the Ricardians, and this goes for the whole classical school, were able to develop understanding of how the reality, the physical reality, determines what happens in the economic sphere. That was the Ricardian view. And it was a very respectable and respected and powerful set of economic ideas that governed economics from before Ricardo, of course, beginning with Adam Smith, but particularly with Ricardo, Mill, all the way up to the 1870s. The so-called marginalist revolution of the 1870s was generally understood as a revolution in the theory of value. What was generally pointed out, histories of economic thought generally point out, that the Ricardians, the classicals, believed in a cost theory of value, maybe a labor theory of value, cost theory of value, which is another way of saying that the scarcity of resources determines the value of output. But that was a subset of the more overall picture which they had, that all laws, all chains, systematic chains of cause and effect in the economic sphere are to be attributed to the physical realities. The Marxist revolution pointed out that you have to take into account consumer desires, you have to take into account the complexity of human desires, the fact that there is such a thing as diminishing marginal utility, okay, besides diminishing returns on the physical level, you've got diminishing marginal utility, and that changes one's picture. One's understanding of how value is determined is fundamentally changed in a revolutionary way by recognizing such elementary facts as diminishing marginal utility. In other words, the consumer has a role to play in determining value. Menger's book of 1871 certainly was one of the pioneers in developing the central understanding of the theory of value. But I'm going to claim that Menger glimpsed a much more fundamental truth. That fundamental truth can be represented as follows. I'm going to draw a schematic sketch. I'm going to put on top resources. I'm going to put on the bottom consumer goods, called consumer satisfactions. Okay? You start out with resources. You finish up with consumer satisfactions. In the middle, you've got producers. Let me just call them producers. Producers translate resources into consumer satisfactions. That's the most basic structure of an economy. Producers, they translate resources into consumer satisfactions. So that you start out with a piece of land, you dig in the land, you get metal, from the metal you make automobiles satisfy consumer desires. Okay? So you go all the way down with all of the thousands of components of the automobile, with resources, producers, many stages, many steps in the process, in the production process, until finally you've got your automobile rolling off the assembly lines, being shipped from who knows where to the New York market, and that's your consumer satisfactions. At the same time as you're producing automobiles, you're producing steak dinners, you're producing vacations, you're producing medical surgical operations. You're producing a whole lot of things that take resources and translate them into consumer satisfactions. These are all interact. That's what the economy is all about. The Ricardian view sees causation in the same direction as the production. Physical production starts with resources and finishes with consumer satisfactions. And it's the pattern of resources, the pattern of nature-given resources, with all the scarcities and relative scarcities that are expressed in the body of resources. It's those resources that govern the patterns of production, that governs the market prices of resources, the market prices of intermediate goods, the market prices of capital goods, the market prices of cars that can roll off the assembly line. Okay, it's what happens here that determines what happens down there. That is the general perspective. A subset of that perspective generated the cost theory of value. Okay? Menger in 1871 glimpsed a perspective which was utterly revolutionary. This was that he understood that the chains of causation operated in the opposite direction. That was absolutely revolutionary. He glimpsed that. So that from that perspective, the cost theory of value comes to be replaced with a marginal utility theory of value. Okay? Not this way, but this way. But this is a subset. This marginal utility theory of value is a subset of the larger perspective which Menger glimpsed. He didn't glimpse it with great clarity. Sometimes, you're in a storm and it's pitch dark, and there's a flash of lightning, and for a moment you see exactly where you are. You see that you're flying into a mountain. You get a glimpse of what it is, but then it gets dark again. That's what happened over here. Menger had this glimpse, right? And it was an incomplete glimpse, right? It was a glimpse. It was a glimpse. And as I say, when you recognize what was going on in that glimpse, you see that this is really a fundamental revolutionary idea. What happens in subsequent years, my thesis will be, is that this subset of that glimpse came to be developed by the Austrians as the central tenet in Austrian economics. This was a major contribution. There's a paper by Rosenstein-Redan in 1927, Marginal Utility. Very sophisticated paper, very sophisticated 1920s paper on marginal utility, where you can see this was what the Austrians were claiming. If they were claiming any uniqueness, this was their contribution to 20th century economic thought. Very powerful and and sophisticated development of marginal utility theory to replace the old discredited cost theory of value. But that's it. What about the larger picture? That was lost. That was lost. So that when we said that the period, what I call period B, period from 1914 to, say, 1932, when I say that was the period of greatest Austrian success in its professional context, this was a period in which the original Mengerian glimpse of that perspective was not there. That was not there. It was not there, and it was simply not seen. It was simply not seen. Menger stopped. He retired in 1903. He lived on till I think 1921, but he was no longer teaching after 1903. Böhm-Bawerk died in 1914. Wiese was still, he died in 26. But Wiese and his disciples were still busy with the marginal utility theory of value. That was Rosenstein Redin. He was part of that development. He was a student of Meyer, who was who took over the Wiese chair. What happened in the 1930s, as I indicated earlier, was that the socialist economic calculation debate taught Mises and Hayek that their position had been misunderstood, and that they had misunderstood the thought that they were fighting against. Until then, they had thought that, well, the Marshallians, the Walrasians, and us, the Austrians, were all saying basically the same thing. A theory of value which took into account consumer desires and developed with greater sophistication as the years went by. The socialist calculation debate taught Mises and Hayek that they had misunderstood the difference between their understanding of the market and the mainstream understanding of the market. And this forced Mises and Hayek, in the late 30s and during the 40s. It forced them to rethink their own understanding of the market. It forced them to rethink it. It didn't force them to change their minds. They didn't have to change their minds. They had to analyze what they were saying all the time, what they had been saying all the time. And Mises was, in this way, able, in his 1940 Nationaleconomie, which was the forerunner of human action, he was able to articulate a whole perspective on the economic system which recaptured the original Mengerian perspective, that what determines everything in a market system is human beings, human action. In fact, it's not just human action in the sense of consumer satisfactions. It's human action in the sense of people. People determine everything that happens in an economic system. The resources are a background, a passive background. Sure, they're important. Sure, if you're marooned on a fertile, lush island, you'll have a different economic experience than if you're marooned on a barren rock. Right? Sure. We understand that. But the point is that whatever happens will happen against the background of the resources, but it's what human beings do, what human beings want, what human beings see, what human beings believe, what human beings expect, what human beings create. That's what determines the economic system. That's what determines values. That's what determines the structure of production. That's what determines the financial system. That's what determines everything in an economic system against the background of resources. Resources are a passive background. Notice how this differs from the Marshallian view. The Marshallian view, as you may know, was a kind of a marriage of the cost theory of value with the marginal utility of value. Mises says both are true. there's a supply curve and a demand curve. The supply curve reflects cost, the demand curve reflects utility. It's two blades of a scissors. The market price is determined by the interaction of the physical and the utility sides of the market. That was a Marshallian perspective. What Mises saw, and he developed this in his 1940, but he developed it earlier in his essays in the 1930s. But this was articulated as a part of a system in his 1940 book, and that was developed even more in his Human Action in 1948. So this is what forced Mises in the 1940s to rethink and restate everything that was fundamental to Austrian thought, and Hayek was doing exactly the same thing in those same years. Hayek was doing it in London, Mises was doing it in Geneva and New York, and what Hayek was doing, he was focusing on knowledge, what people know, right? And this was both together in this, what I call that decade, the decade of the 40s, that intense intellectual activity of the 40s that represented a revolutionary development. It represented a recapturing of the Mengerian vision that he had sort of caught a glimpse of it, that the direction of value, the direction of causation is from bottom up, not from top down. One can see this perhaps most dramatically, but we can see this intellectual development by taking a look at a list that Fritz Machlup provided of the fundamental tenets of Austrian economics. And a number of his contributions. Fritz Machlup was one of the brilliant young economists of the 1920s who studied in Vienna under Mises in the 1920s, and he came to this country in the 30s and became one of the most eminent American economists. And he never forgot Austrian economics. He never forgot he was never disloyal to Austrian economics, but the Austrian economics that he was loyal to was the Austrian economics of the 1920s. And at a number of his contributions, he listed what are the crucial elements of Austrian economics. And I'll go over some of them with you. First of all, he says methodological individualism. That means that you focus attention on the individual chooser, the individual decision maker. That was the fundamental contribution of Austrian economics. Methodological subjectivism, very closely related to methodological individualism. You've got to pay attention not to the rain that brings about the manufacture of umbrellas, but to the expectation of rain that generates the production of umbrellas. Or more accurately, it's the expectation of the discomfort that you'll feel when it rains on you that generates the production of umbrellas. So you're not focusing on rain, you're focusing on human beings. Okay? Methodological subjectivism. Marginalism. Okay? This was a fundamental contribution of the Austrians. The dominance of utility. The concept of opportunity cost. This goes back all the way back to Wieser, Menger. Well, you'll find it in Menger, articulated explicitly in Wieser, back in the early years of the Austrian school, 1870s and 1880s. The time structure of production. That, of course, goes back to Böhm-Bawerk. That was his major insight that time structure matters. Time preference matters. Therefore, time structure production matters. Now, there's no question about it, that means that Machlab was absolutely right in emphasizing these elements in Austrian economics. But I know that I'm speaking to students and scholars who have been exposed to a good deal of economics. None of this, I think, is unique to Austrian economics. Methodological individualism, that everything depends on the human decision. Who doesn't know that? Which neoclassical economics textbook doesn't emphasize that? Subjectivism, okay. Maybe the Austrians were pushing subjectivism a little bit more than others. Marginalism, that's part of the language of economics. Dominance of utility, okay. Maybe the Austrians were pushing utility a little bit more, diminishing marginal utility a little bit more than some others. Opportunity cost. Every economist likes to talk down to lay people. You don't understand opportunity costs. Well, okay, everybody understands that. Time structure of production. Well, there's not really too much left of the Austrian uniqueness in understanding that capital theory and production takes time, and it involves long-term decision-making over time. All of this was what Machlab absorbed in the 1920s. In the 1920s, some of these ideas had not been explicitly introduced into mainstream economics. That was what Lionel Robbins was doing in 1932 in his Nature and Significance. He was pointing to methodological individualism. He was pointing to methodological subjectivism. He was pointing to opportunity cost. He was pointing to allocation. You know, till the 1920s, in British economics, the idea that economizing has to do with allocation of scarce means among competing multiple ends hadn't really been articulated. It sounds strange to us, but Robbins was really introducing something revolutionary. He said it's not revolutionary, but it really was, in the sense that it hadn't been emphasized. What Robbins was doing, he says, you want to understand what you British economists have been doing, recognize that you're talking about individuals who economize, who are allocating resources among competing ends. So that's why in the subsequent decades, textbooks began to teach that economics deals with allocation of scarce resources. In fact, that was a misunderstanding of Robbins. I don't want to get into that at this point. Robbins was talking about individual allocation of resources. The textbooks, of course, talk about allocation of resources at the societal level. Robbins wasn't talking about that. So, but the point is that Robbins forced the British mainstream to recognize that their economics has to be restated in terms of the methodological individualism, methodological subjectivism, the marginalism, all of the items that were right up front in the Austrian, the corpus of Austrian thought up until the 1930s. What is arresting, what is remarkable, what raises our eyebrows, is that Machlab had no inkling of what he was leaving out. He was leaving out fundamental elements in modern Austrian economics. He wasn't aware of them because because his Austrian economics was the economics before 1932. He studied under Mises in the 1920s. I speak of Machlab with great respect. He was a colleague of mine after he retired from Princeton. He was a colleague at New York University, and he was very helpful to the Austrian program. Pete Betke was generous enough and kind enough to mention the Austrian program at New York University. Machlab was helpful. He was helpful in getting us to bring Ludwig Lachmann to the program at New York University. He was helpful in Pete mentioned the late Professor Don Lavoie's doctoral dissertation. I can tell you that when Machlab, he was on the committee, when he read that, he said, "This is one of the best dissertations that I've ever seen." But I can tell you that Machlab didn't understand that dissertation. I'm telling you that. He was there. I heard the questions he was asking. He recognizes this is great work, right? Don Lavoie his dissertation was subsequently his 1985 book on the socialist calculation debate, and Don was articulating the Austrian perspective of Mises and Hayek in that dissertation. Machlab didn't understand it because Machlab had left out two of the major elements in post-1950 Austrian economics. These processes, these elements were, first, markets are processes of learning and discovery. Machlab paid no attention to that. It's as if he wasn't aware of it. And this is from Machlab, who wrote edited a multi-volume collection on knowledge in economics. He was not aware. Well, he was aware. He had read Hayek. He was a great colleague of Hayek. He and Hayek were buddies. They really were. They had a tremendous respect for each other. But Machlab never fully absorbed what he was reading in Hayek. Machlab never understood markets as processes of learning and discovery. That was the crucial contribution of the revolution that occurred in the 1940s. Second, Machlab, who did mention methodological individualism, meaning the focus on the individual decision maker, he did not point out that the decision maker in post-1950 Austrian economics were the decision maker who is operating in the context of radical uncertainty. Call it Knightian uncertainty if you want. It's that part of Knight's book that all the Knightians forgot to read, right? All the Chicago economists, they were brought up on risk, uncertainty, and profit. They read the first section, the first part of the book, the second part of the book. They didn't read the third part of the book. But that was Knightian uncertainty, okay? The choice in the context of radical uncertainty, not the Robinsian idea of allocation of given means among given ends, right? Allocation, this is, you've got somebody offers you a plate with alternatives on it. You can take one and one only. Which one do you take? That's the Robinsian idea of allocation. Because Robbins was still talking based on the Austrianism that he learned in the 1920s. This was the Austrianism that became successfully absorbed into the mainstream. See, one of the reasons why the Austrians sort of fell down in the 1930s is because they themselves believed that their doctrines had been successfully absorbed into the mainstream. So there's no point about emphasizing, underlining that you're an Austrian. That was Machlab's position. Machlab saw himself as a mainstream economist. He was proud of his Austrian roots, but he didn't think those roots required him to keep on saying, I'm an Austrian. Sure, I'm an Austrian. But that's why I went to this graduate school. You went to a different graduate school. He didn't feel it necessary to emphasize that he had any different overall perspective in economics, because he didn't. Because he left out these major elements that became articulated only later. It was only Hayek and Mises in the 1940s who began to realize what they had been saying all along, what the Austrians had been saying all along. What's missing in Machlab's list. I focus on Machlab not to criticize Machlab. Machlab was, as I say, I have a deep respect for a great scholar, and somebody who was extremely helpful to us in developing the Austrian program. In other words, to sum up what we've been saying, the development of Austrian economics happened something like this. Menger, in 1871, had glimpsed an economic world in which chains of economic causation were set into motion exclusively by people. He had glimpsed that. His followers, Bambawerk, Wiese, and their students, and the school that they developed in the immediate post-World War I years, the 1920s, focused fundamentally on the theory of value, and they failed to grasp that more enveloping vision that Menger had. It was Mises and Hayek who, as a result of their exposure to the socialist economic calculation debate, began to realize that they had to dig into the fundamentals of their understanding of the market chains of cause and effect. And when they did that, they developed a whole new perspective. It was a perspective which recaptured the original Mengerian vision. I'm not claiming that Mises and Hayek in the 1940s did this by rereading Menger. I'm not claiming that. I'm claiming that they, by working on their own, by digging into the fundamental roots of what they themselves had been thinking, they were able to articulate and to express explicitly the fundamental ideas that were able to show, to enable us to understand how the market is a process of mutual discovery. Mutual discovery can be articulated in a number of ways. Mises, as I'll try and show this afternoon, articulated it in terms of entrepreneurial discovery. Hayek articulated it in terms of the spread of knowledge. Both of them saw the market process as a process of causation, a causation of broadening information, broadening discovery, broadening an expansion of knowledge. This is the meaning of the market. This has had important implications for setting Austrian economics apart from the mainstream. It's this uniqueness of the Mises-Hayek articulation of Austrian economics that was responsible for the subsequent revival of interest in Austrian thought. You here today, and the many young scholars over the past 30, 40 years have been drawn to Austrian economics by the unique insights that Mises and Hayek developed, which depend on precisely those two elements that Machlap left out of his list: markets as a process and choice, decision-making in the context of radical uncertainty. It's the way in which Austrians have tried to respond to these two elements that constitute the possibility of a continuing progress in the Austrian tradition. Thank you very much.